One of the biggest ways that HTML5 has improved the way that we can create web pages is with forms. And in this video, we'll be looking at a few of the cool HTML5 features that you can use in your sites with usually just a single line of code. So let's set ourselves up first off with a new folder. So within our complete web developer course folder, I'm going to create a new one, which I'll call 10 HTML5 CSS3. And then I'll go back over to my text editor where I've still got my mobile apps page, and I'll just get rid of everything that we don't need there. And we'll treat that as our starting point. There we go. And then I'll use File, Save As, and I'll save it in our new folder, HTML5 CSS3. There it is. And then I'll open that up in Chrome. And now we're ready to go. So let's set up a simple form. We're not going to worry about Bootstrap or anything this time. Not particularly concerned about style here, it's more functionality. So let's start with our humble input element, and we'll give it a type of text. And the first thing that I'm going to show you is actually something that we've used throughout the course, but is HTML5 specific, and that is the placeholder. And you know how that works. It just means that the browser will show that text, and then when you start typing, it will disappear. So that's familiar enough, but we wouldn't have it without HTML5. I'll just put that in a paragraph tag. And then let's look at our first new feature. And the first one I'm going to show you is autofocus. So again, we've got a simple input with a type of text, and all we have to do with autofocus is add the word autofocus to that input, and then as soon as we load the page, it will take the focus from any other element. So if you want your user to particularly start their form with a particular input, then that's what autofocus will do for you. Note that in XHTML, which is a stricter version of HTML5, you can't just use empty attributes like that. So you would have to specify autofocus is equal to autofocus, like that. And that will still work in HTML5, but in HTML5 itself, it's not as fussy. So you can get away with just putting autofocus. That's perfectly fine. So that's pretty cool. Moving swiftly on though, we can very easily with HTML5 specify that the browser should not autocomplete. So most browsers remember the content that users have typed into specific fields, but in some cases we might want to switch that off. And that's really easy to do with HTML5. We just use autocomplete is off. Now here that won't make any difference, but if you wanted to get a user's credit card number or something like that without predicting it, then you could use autocomplete is off. Note that on is the default, so we wouldn't have to use that. The next cool feature I want to show you is required. So we saw in the jQuery section how to do validation with JavaScript, and later we did it with PHP as well. But some basic validation is built in to HTML5. And one thing we can do is use the attribute required to force a certain field to be filled in. So I'll just put a submit field at the end there. And then let's have a look. If I try and submit, then it will insist that we fill out that field. A related tag that we've already seen is one with a type of email and let's put that above the submit. So if I put some text in there that's not an email address and try and submit, in fact I get that error first, but if I then fill in that field and submit, then it gives us a nice error message if they don't put a valid email address in. So let's just label these a little bit. So we've got a placeholder, autofocus, autocomplete, off, required, and email. All right, getting to more complex stuff, we can use a pattern to insist that an input has a certain pattern to it. So we would use that like this. So we use the pattern attribute. So if, for example, we wanted to insist that they enter a single digit, then we could use square brackets and 0 to 9. And then, as long as I validated all of those, if I put a 2-digit number in there, it says please match the correct format. And if I get it right, then it submits the form. These patterns are standard regex, or regular expressions, which again we saw in the PHP chapter. But if you want to check out some examples, there's a whole website out there called HTML5pattern.com, which gives you a bunch of examples. So for example, you could specify a username with 2 to 20 characters, a valid Twitter username, etc., etc. You get the idea. So that's a really easy way to validate certain data types without even using any JavaScript. If you thought that was cool though, wait till you see this. With HTML5, we can set up autocomplete in our forms, again, without using any JavaScript. And we do that by setting up a data list with a certain ID. So if I use my classic example, I might want to have a data list of names. And then within that data list, I would set up options, just like with drop-downs, that might have a value of Rob, and then a display of Rob as well. I might have Kirsten, Tommy, and Ralphie. There we go. And then I just set up my text input as usual. And I add a list to it with an ID matching the data list. That simple. So now, if I start typing there, it will predict which ones I'm looking for and even give me a little drop down of all the available ones as well. So I think that's a hugely powerful new option, and in many ways preferable to a drop down, because you can get to what you're wanting to enter much quicker, especially if you've got a long list of potential values. You can even add a drop down within the data list itself, and then if your browser doesn't support the new data list feature, then it will show a drop-down menu there. So that's a really nice, elegant way of degrading should the autocomplete feature not be available. Another useful feature is being able to link an input to a specific form. So by default, for HTML5, if you wanted an input to be linked to the form, you would have to put it inside that form. But that's not always useful. If you're generating a table and you want a number of mini forms within that table, then quite often you'll want to put your input outside the form. But that's now easy to do with HTML5. So you can put your code outside the form and you just link it to a specific form by its ID. Simple. And then it will appear wherever you want it on the page, but when that form is submitted, then this data will be submitted with it. On a similar note, previously when a form was submitted, you could only have a single action option on the form itself. So we might have something like processform.php, but you might want to go to different locations depending on which submit button has been clicked. And you can do that very easily using form action on your submit button, and you can then just specify a different URL for that particular submit button. You can even specify a particular method for each button, although I'm not too sure why you'd want to do that. But you can have get for some buttons and post for others. The final new cool thing I want to show you with forms is how easy it is to upload multiple files with HTML5 forms. So the traditional input for files would be an input with type of file. Simple as that. And then you would choose your file in the usual way. But if you want the user to be able to select multiple files, you just add the multiple attribute to your input, and you can then choose, let's just pick 2 files using Command or Control on Windows, and then it's selected 2 files, and then both of those will be uploaded when you submit the form. And that's it. I hope you'll agree with me that all of those are very useful and save a lot of time in programming if you want to do any of this sort of validation, autocomplete, or fancy submitting. That's just the beginning of HTML5 though, and in the next video we'll be looking at how we can use HTML5 to insert audio and video very easily into our web pages.